Good.
Good afternoon, everybody.
Hello, this is my third.
How are we all doing today? Can I have everybody's attention, please? Thank you. How are we all doing today?
Great.
Good.
That is good. That is good. My name is Zachary Turner. I'll be your guide today. You may call me Zach if you prefer. Our captain is JC. Say hi to JC.
Hi, JC.
Very good. Now, today we're going to be traveling down three beautiful creeks, the Brookgreen Creek, the Still Creek, and the Oaks Creek, respectively. And as we are traveling down these creeks, I'm going to talk about the history of Brookgreen Gardens, particularly our rice growing history. Because believe it or not, before we were Brookgreen Gardens, we were once 4 former rice plantations. But before I get too far into that, I want to go into some safety protocols, just so you guys are aware of them. You guys see those 2 wooden pillars right over there by the docks? Those are called pilings, and they allow our captain to easily navigate back into the dock, especially during windy days. Now, today is not particularly windy, but they are still very important. And because of that, I just please ask you to not stick your hands, feet, or really any other appendage out of the boat. You might have tails, I don't know. And it's very important that you keep all of those, everything inside this boat, because if you have your hand sticking out and one of your body parts hits that piling, it's not going to feel good. Also, I really don't want to see you guys sticking anything, your hands out at any point during the tour, because there are wild animals out here, particularly wild alligators, and like a mom from Costco, they will not hesitate to take free samples. So, just please ask you to leave with all your fingers intact. Secondly, I please ask you to refrain from smoking or vaping on this tour. This is a non-smoking, non-vaping tour. Not only is that a health concern, it's also it could also be a bother to the person next to you. Speaking of bother, I just please ask you to silence your phones. Now, you don't have to turn them off. I just ask you to keep them on silent or vibrate. And that also means no phone calls at any point during the tour. If you need to make a phone call or you're receiving a phone call, just please shut it off and wait until the tour is over. I really appreciate that. And lastly, but certainly not least, in the case of an emergency, you'll see this net full of life preservers. Now, if an emergency does occur, I want you guys to pull on these black cords right here. Helping to pull down these cords will release the net full of life preservers. Once the net is on the ground full of life preservers, pick one up, put it on your person, and buckle yourself up. We're going to figure out the rest from there. Now, does everybody understand what I'm saying? Alright, with that being said, let's get on for a tour. Now, we're currently on the Brookgreen Canal. This is a man-made canal heading out to the Brookgreen Creek. This canal and this creek is placed on the Brookgreen Plantation, one of the 4 plantations that make up Brookgreen Gardens. This plantation was the largest plantation based on revenue and also production, as this plantation in particular produced 3.9 million pounds of rice per year during its plantation life. And everything from the Welcome Center down to the zoo is technically on the Brookgreen property. Brookgreen Plantation property. Now, if we turn right here, leaving this canal, we'd be going north. Now it would take us to the Laurel Hill and Springfield Plantation. We're not going there. We're going south, which would be to our left. And now it'll take us down to the Oaks Plantation. All these plantations here are between 2,000 to 3,000 acres, give or take. And all the plantations combined, along with our sister property, Huntington Beach State Park, makes up about 9,127 acres. We actually own Huntington Beach State Park, but we lease it out to the state. And all this property was purchased way back in 1930 by a very lovely couple from New York City. Their names were Archer and Anna Hyatt Huntington. Anyone familiar with that name? I mean, I did just say Huntington Beach State Park. But they're also known for Huntington Beach, California. Yes, all those parks and beaches and many other businesses that have the name Huntington on it all stem from the very same family. That's because the Huntingtons are a very old and influential family here in America. In fact, Archer's father, Collis Huntington, was one of the 4 men to help invest and create the Transcontinental Railroad, among other ventures. So this family had a lot of wealth, a lot of generational wealth. And when Collis passed away, all that wealth and his father and all his industry went to his son, Archer, who continued on to be a businessman and philanthropist like his forebears. But he had other passions as well. He was an historian as well as an architect. He loved architecture in particular, particularly the style of Spanish, Portuguese, and Moroccan architecture. You can see a lot of that influence here at Brookgreen Gardens, but no more so than over at his and his wife's winter home at Huntington Beach State Park, known as Adelia Castle. If you guys have ever been to Huntington Beach State Park, I recommend going there. It's really cool. Now, I'm going to take a quick pause on the Huntingtons to talk about where we currently are right now. Now, this area is known as Beyond the Garden Wall. This area is known as Beyond the Garden Wall. It's actually a walking trail that you guys can take here in the gardens if you ever want to walk back here. And over here is the one remaining area, the one rice field, one of the two rice fields that we actually maintain. Now, we don't maintain this for commercial use. We're not growing rice anymore. We only maintain it so people have an idea what a rice field will look like back then. And this green contraption right here is known as a trunk gate. Now, trunk gates are very important when it comes to growing rice, as it's essentially the irrigation system. It allows water from the creek to come in and out of the field. Now, I'll talk more about rice growing and trunk gates later on in our tour, but I want you guys to have a mental image of a trunk gate when it comes back in the conversation. So when I say trunk gate, you guys should be thinking of that. That said, let's get back to the hunting. Now, Archer had a wife. Her name Anna Hyatt Huntington. She was also our other co-founder of Huntington Beach State Park and Brookgreen Gardens. She was actually a renowned sculpture artist, and she's the reason we're a sculpture garden to begin with. In fact, some of our earliest works here on the ground were created by her, and that includes our entrance sculpture, the first sculpture you see coming into Brookgreen Gardens, known as the Fighting Stallions. That was of her creation. And she's also the reason the Huntingtons came down here in the first place. You see, Anna Hyatt Huntington early in her life contracted tuberculosis, and she lived in New York City. They have really bad winters in New York City, even back then. And having tuberculosis in a cold environment can have a real be really bad on your health. And it got so bad for her that her doctor suggested that she needs to move to more warmer climates during the winter time, and she was going to improve. And so she and her husband Archer made the decision to move down here to South Carolina during the winter time. And it must have done a trick because she lived to be 97 years old. Now, they came down here with the sole intention of just making a winter home for themselves. And that's why they purchased all this property. It was just going to be private property, all this. What you did with the rest of the area, I really have no idea. But within a year of exploring the grounds that they purchased, they realized how beautiful and how full of rich history everything around here truly was. And so they made the decision in 1931 to officially open up these grounds as Brookgreen Gardens. And at the time, it was the first and largest outdoor public American sculpture garden in the United States. In fact, it still remains so to this day. This Brookgreen Gardens has the largest collection of American sculptures ever known in human history. It's Anna very much prided herself on that. And as well as making it into a sculpture garden, they also converted it into a wildlife sanctuary and as well as a historical preservation. As we have a variety of historical sites as well as wildlife species that are protected on the grounds. And 90 plus years to this day, Brookgreen Gardens is one of the biggest attractions here in the Myrtle Beach area. And in my opinion, I think it's one of the crowning jewels of South Carolina, but that's just my opinion. Now we're slowing down right here, and that's because we have a known sighting of an alligator laying here in the brush. Just look over in that direction in the sawgrass. You should be able to see the tail of an alligator. Or the head of one. It's better. Yep, right there in that little bank. Now he's laying in sawgrass, which is this grass right over here, this greenish yellow grass. It actually gets its name because the tip of the blade looks like a saw blade. But alligators really love this type of grass. That's because when they lay on top of it, all this sawgrass that's crushed up under the bellies will decompose and generate heat, which is not only ideal to raise their body temperature, but also for helping incubating their eggs during mating season. And an alligator can lay between 20 to 50 eggs during their mating season. Imagine if you did that.
Who can make alligator noise?
A lot.
Anyone know how to make alligator noise?
didn't move.
Yes, yes. About a year now. Thank you. Well, that means I'm doing my job right. But, see that birdhouse right there? That is known as a wood duck nesting house. It's for a species of ducks known as a wood duck. And the reason we have these nesting houses is because they lost habitat. You see, they make their homes out of these really tall trees called gold cypress trees. They can reach up to 130 feet and be about 14 feet wide in circumference. They were massive trees. But when they were all cut down to make rice fields, these wood ducks unfortunately lost their habitat. And they were, for many centuries, they were basically subjugated to the elements, predators, and hunters. To the point by 1930 they were considered critically endangered to the point of extinction. Now the Huntingtons were aware of this, and what they did is they commissioned the creation of those nesting houses. It allows the wood ducks to raise their young in relative peace. That's why they have cones underneath. Oh, we got another alligator right over there, kind of laying on the top. Right now is a great time for him to be hunting. Yes. Well, they're designed. Well, the houses are designed to accommodate like that. Well, they fly in. Yeah, they fly in. Yeah, but they're primarily just to store their ducks, keep them safe from predators. That's actually why there's cones underneath like that. They keep them safe from snakes and raccoons. And thankfully they're no longer endangered. They're a very stable, healthy population. They are very beautiful. I like how they have a very dangerous face, but I think it makes them adorable. Now we are currently on the Still Creek. We have left the Brookgreen Creek and we are now on the Still Creek. Can anyone tell me why this creek gets the name Still Creek? Because the water is still. That is a wonderful guess. Any other guesses? It's still here. It's also a wonderful guess. Any others?
Alcohol.
Alcohol? Oh, moonshine? All great guesses. But it's a trick question. No one actually knows. I'm a bit of a trick. Got a little alligator right there. No worries, they're not going to jump out and get you, I promise. They're usually under the pressure, if you leave me, I'll leave you. Unless I'm hungry. But we're up here. Because I like to have fun. Now, over here I like to call the Turtle Resort. This area right here I like to call the Turtle Resort. It's actually just a collection of branches that fell off a bunch of trees and just floated to the center. But right now I give it a name because it's a known resting and sunbathing spot for turtles. Right there is a yellow belly slider. It gets its name due to the yellow markings under its chin as well as on the belly of its shell. There are very common turtle species you'll see around here, but we also have others. We have red-eared sliders as well as soft-shelled turtles. We also have two species of snapping turtle in these creeks as well. We have the common freshwater snapping turtle and, of course, the alligator snapping turtle. Because if we're not anything, we're consistent on brand. I'm sorry, I'm just having too much fun. I'm always joking. But the most common turtle you'll see around here is yellow belly sliders. They're very common to see around here, and they don't bite you. Yes. So, no worries. Now, if you guys look over here on your right, you'll see this whole island that we've been kind of coasting alongside of. Now, this island is called Flag Island, and it was named after the last owners of the Brookgreen plantation, known as the Flag family. Believe it or not, this whole island at one point in time was a rice field. Hard to believe now, but all these trees, all the bushes, all the sawgrass was completely flattened out. Flat and open. And that's because rice does not grow in uneven forested terrain. It needs a lot of space, a lot of water, and a lot of sunlight. And trees kind of hinder a lot of that. So trees gotta go. Oh, look, more turtles right over there. What type of turtle is those, everybody? Very good, you're learning something. But yeah, since Whole Island was once a rice field, and this is roughly about 40 acres. Roughly about 40 acres of rice field at one point in time. But this wasn't the only rice field. In fact, just to broaden your scope of how many rice fields there were in this area, everywhere you look around you, at one point in time, was flat open rice field, and it went on for miles in every direction. In fact, in the 1800s, you would have actually been able to see the oceans from this creek. The oceans in that direction. That was how flat and expansive the rice fields were back then. This was a massive industry. And what's even crazier is to realize that rice is actually not even native to South Carolina. It was brought here, and it was brought here by accident. Now, rice is not foreign to the Americas. There are many indigenous cultures that had rice as a basis of their food groups. But South Carolina was not one of those places. It was brought here by accident in 1630 by Madagascar merchant traders. And I'll explain how that happened. Now, in 1630, a ship from Madagascar stopped at a very tiny, small, insignificant port town in the southern part of what was once the Carolina colony. This little town was called Charlestown. I'm sure you've never heard of it. And in Charlestown, this ship stopped to get repairs. You see, the night before they got caught in a really bad storm during the travels, and they needed to fix up their ship. So while in Charlestown, getting their ship fixed up, they decided to trade with the locals. One of the things that they traded with the locals in Charlestown was Madagascar rice. And very soon, the people of Charlestown realized that South Carolina has a very good environment to grow rice. And this is due to two reasons, or two factors in particular. One is the weather here. Believe it or not, it gets really hot here in South Carolina. Really hot and really humid, which is ideal to grow rice. Rice likes it where there's a lot of moisture. It's easy for them to settle in. That's why you'll never see rice fields in very cold, arid environments. So there's no rice fields in England, no rice fields in Germany, no rice fields in Anatolia, and there's definitely no rice fields where I'm from, Michigan. I'm from a very exotic place. And because the environment here is very suitable to grow rice, this was the ideal location. The other factor is the creeks themselves. These creeks, and by extension our rivers, are very special. Does anyone know why these creeks and rivers around here are very special? That's correct, ma'am. These are tidal creeks and tidal rivers. Now, just so you know, these are not brackish water. There's no salt water in these creeks. Salt water actually kills rice, so growing rice in salt water is not ideal. These are all completely freshwater creeks and rivers, but they are affected by the ocean tides, and I'll explain why. Now, all these creeks here, the Brookgreen, the Still, and the Oaks Creek, which we are currently on right now, is heading towards the Waccamaw River. The Waccamaw River is kind of the big river around these parts, but it's not the only one. We also have the Petey, the Sandpit, and the Black River. All very similar to the Waccamaw River and freshwater and tidal design. And all these rivers converge, or collide, whatever you want to call it, into one area known as Winyah Bay. See another alligator?
Yeah, big one.
Big one right over there.
Good eye, Jen.
Yeah.
I think we got his attention. Daddy just doesn't like my voice. It's okay, it's not for everybody. But, yes. I don't actually know what gender that alligator is. Unfortunately, finding out is what I like to call the hard way. So, I'd rather not do the hard way. But I can tell you kind of a basic gist to identify gender. That's actually by size. Now, primarily, female alligators are about 12 feet long. Males are usually about 14. But in truth, that's just a rough estimate, because alligators will continue growing throughout their entire lives. They can live a long time, too. They can live into their hundreds. Nature's been very kind to them.
That is a good size.
They're big. My captain says it's probably about 10 feet long. And to be honest, there's actually a decent way to measure them. It's basically taking the tip of their snout and measuring up to their eyes, converting those inches into feet. So say its snout is about 12 inches long. You convert that, it'll be about 12 feet long. 14 inches on the snout, it'll be about 14 feet long. 30 inches on the snout, I'm going home. I'm just joking.
Measure it. Tell us what it is.
Unfortunately, I don't get paid enough for that. So we're gonna let this nice fellow over here, just mind his own business, because he's not bothering us. In fact, I think we might be bothering him. We're a big guy. We're big girl. Again, I can't really tell. Over there.
No, don't do that.
Also, they're quite good jumpers.
Oh.
Get out of here.
I'm sorry.
Your explanation of the water business and
Oh yes. Well yes. Well, as I was about to explain before, our nice alligator friend, came into a picture. As I was explaining, all these rivers converge into Winyao Bay, which is where the salt water and the fresh water will meet, but it doesn't fully mix. Now this is a brackish spot. This is where salt water and fresh water is mixed together. You don't grow rice in Winyao Bay, but because salt water is denser than fresh water, it actually creates kind of a gelish-like wall in between the two bodies. So it doesn't fully mix. But what happens is that the ocean tide is going to push on this wall. And it's going to push over into the fresh water, and it's going to start pushing fresh water upstream. And that pushback goes about 30 to 40 miles upstream. And that's why twice a day we go up and down with the tides of the ocean. Now right now we're fairly low tide, but the water is actually coming in. It's starting to rise. And it's going to continue doing that pretty much all day until it reaches high tide. And then once that happens, the water is going to start coming back out again. And it's going to be low tide again. Then high tide, then low tide. It's going to continue doing that until the end of time, or if the moon explodes, whatever happens first. But these two factors, so this factor in particular is really great for growing rice because it creates a natural irrigation system that these plantations can utilize to basically grow the rice, Because usually they would often have, wells and things like that, to bring in water. But having these creeks here is just naturally get a natural abundance of water that can forever be utilized. And that's where the trunk gates come into play. That's where they use the trunk gate to allow the water to come in and out, depending on high tide and low tide. And these two factors made South Carolina a great environment to grow rice. I say it's a good environment, that does not mean it's an easy environment. In fact, this is actually some of the hardest areas to cultivate any type of field, any type of crops and fields. Now this is due to our third factor, which is the mud. Now, for the record, the mud here is very fertile, very clay-like. It's actually a great source of material to grow anything out of. A great source of soil. The problem is navigating through this stuff. This stuff is super soft, super sticky, almost akin to quicksand. It gets the name gumbo and fluff mud for a reason. And because of that, just keep in mind, this is the 1600s when rice was starting to grow. Back then, they didn't have the technology we have today. So there was no tractors, no bulldozers, no cranes, none of that stuff. Even if they did have that stuff, can't get that stuff out here because of the mud. It would sink right in. They could barely get farm animals out here because they would sink in the mud as well. Because of that, everything in these plantations was done by hand and by hand alone. So people were literally coming out here and cutting down trees that were 130 feet tall and 14 feet wide by hand, using nothing but saws and axes. And this was a long process. By the time you actually cut down your first trees and the time you actually made a rice field, that could take up to 7 years. And it was dangerous too. As you can see, we have very big alligators. And I wasn't making a joke. They are opportunistic. They will find whatever they can get their jaws in. But honestly, they're not even the biggest danger. The biggest danger is the venomous snakes we have here. we have a variety of venomous snakes. We have copperheads, cottonmouths, water moccasins, and many, many more I'd like to list down, but I just forgot. It's not my best joke. But they often hunted in the rice fields that were being, worked on, because there's a lot of toads out there. And because of that, they were very dangerous. Back then, there was no anti-venom cure. So if you got bit by a snake, you just hope it was a dry bite, or else, c'est la vie. And it was very dangerous. And even if you managed to survive all that, there was always a good chance you could catch swamp fever. And at the time, it was basic, which we now know today as malaria. At the time, it was called swamp fever. Malaria was a huge issue back then. And as a result, it was extremely dangerous to work on these fields. But the demand for rice was growing, and to keep up with that demand, they needed a very large labor force. And unfortunately, their choice of labor was predominantly West Africans. Now, they originally would use the labor force of indigenous people, the Wakamas, the Pedis, the Sand people. They were all often used as labor in these plantations. But because they were not immune to the European diseases, a lot of them died off. And those that were not brought to plantations, they just left this area and went out west and joined larger tribes. So, predominantly it became solely West African. And these people grew up on the west coast of Africa, otherwise known as the Rice Coast. And they got this name because these people were growing rice for generations before they were ever brought over here. So they had the skill set and the knowledge of growing rice that the Europeans did not have. In fact, they're the ones who created some of the greatest innovations here on these plantations. They're the ones who created the trunk cakes. That was a West African creation. Now, these plantations worked on a labor system split by gender. Now, men were often in charge of cutting down all the trees and creating the rice fields as well as maintaining them, as I mentioned earlier. They were also in charge of constructing very large dirt mounds that were ranged between 7 to 8 feet tall, called dikes. These dikes were designed to basically separate the creek from the fields. That's because these creeks should rise and lower between 3 to 6 feet, depending on the ocean tide. And because of that, especially during hurricane storms, because hurricanes are very frequent around these parts, that can cause an overflow to reach maybe about 7 to 8 feet. So having very high dikes to separate the water, the creek water, from getting into the fields was very good. Because having a little water in the field is good for rice, but too much will drown it. So, these dikes were set up to separate that. And periodically placed in between these dikes were trunk gates. This would give the plantation total control of the irrigation here, so they can allow when water will come in and out. Women, on the other hand, were in charge of all the planting and cultivation of crops here on this plantation. As per West African tradition, farming was predominantly considered women's work. So they were the ones who grew all these crops here, including the rice. And during the planting period of the rice growing season, which will be around late March, women will all come out here and they'll go out to the fields and they'll start creating divots in the soil, either using the palms of their hands or the heel of their foot, creating these divots. This is where they would have the baskets full of rice seed being placed in periodically. And once all the rice was placed in there, they would make sure all the mud was completely covered up. This was a huge endeavor because each rice field is between 40 to 70 acres. It was a very dangerous, it was very backbreaking, it was a very labor-intensive and taxing job, and majority-wise, it was very unrewarding. But it was done nonetheless. Now, I'm gonna take a bit of a pause on stuff like that. We'll talk about some other things while we're here. See that bird right there? That is an aninga. That is a species of bird. It's off. Oh no, actually that's a blue heron. My bad. Great blue heron. Sometimes they, depending on size, you can get them confused with another bird. That's actually called a blue heron. Now we have two species of heron here. We have the blue heron and we have the great blue heron. Now blue herons look like that. They're very tiny and they have very dark blue feathers. Great blue herons are significantly larger. They look like small cranes. And they have a bluish-gray feather design. Now, why they have such a distinction between being called blue herons and great blue herons? Well, I guess the blue herons are just not that great. I know, that's a lame one. Now over here is the fence. Over here by the fence, this separates the Wakamas River from the Oaks Creek. Over there is the Waccamaw River. That's why that guy's on that boat over there. That is actually public waterways. It's part of the Intercoastal Highway, which spans all the way up to Canada, down to the Gulf of Mexico. You can use that to traverse all around the East Coast. It's a collection of various waterways here. Yes, we have that fence up because we are a private property, and we're also a wildlife sanctuary. Every animal in these grounds are protected, including our alligators, because they're pretty swell guys once you get to know them. These birds right over here are known as cormorants. Right over here on these leaves. That's a species of bird known as a cormorant. They are an aquatic bird species, meaning they spend much of their time in the water as they do in the air, and they can do this because they have a thicker layer of oil in their feathers. This allows them to easily transverse from the air into the water by diving. They are expert divers. In fact, cormorants can dive 150 feet into the water to catch their prey. Now, these creatures are not that deep. They're about 3 to 6 feet, depending on the tide. Right now, it's about 3 feet. But they are expert divers nonetheless. That bird right next to it is known as an aninga. That is what an aninga looks like. An aninga, or sometimes called the snake bird, gets its name because, well, how its neck is designed, it looks kind of like a snake, especially when it's in the water. When it's in the water looking for food, it'll kind of bob its head back and forth, and it looks like a snake swimming. That's why we give it the name snake bird. We have a variety of plants here as well. If you guys look along the bank, you'll see a variety of purple and pinkish plants all in the bushes. Now those purple plants are called obedience. And the pinkish rose-like plants in the bushes are known as swamp rose. Now, my favorite type of plant I like to talk about is this grayish material, this grayish plant in the trees. Does anyone know what that grayish plant is? Whoever said Spanish moss, you're correct. You say Spanish moss? She is correct. It is Spanish moss. It is called Spanish moss. But here's the thing. It is not Spanish, and it's not moss. It was completely misnamed. But does anyone know the origin story of where the name comes from? Does anyone know why I got the name Spanish moss? No? Come on, there's no wrong answers except the wrong ones. Alright. I'll tell you. So, first off, Spanish moss is not from Spain. It's not an invasive species. It was not brought over here by anybody. It is native to the southeastern part of North America. So everywhere from East Texas all the way to North Carolina, that is where you'll find Spanish moss. It's also not named by the Spanish. The Spanish have no association with this plant whatsoever. It was actually named by the French. You see, if you don't remember, or you don't remember in your history books when you were in middle school, a huge chunk of the Midwest in early colonial American history was French territory. Everywhere up from Canada down to New Orleans was technically French territory. And from New Orleans, a group of French explorers made their way out from the city, exploring the southeastern part of North America. During their travels, they came across the grayish plant. When they looked at it, they thought, gee, this looks like the long bushy beards of the Spanish conquista down in Florida. So they gave it the name Verde Español, which just means Spanish beards. For those who are native speakers of Spanish or are really good at speaking Spanish, I apologize, I am doing my best. But it was eventually co-opted into Spanish moss, which is the more common association with the name. I also mentioned it's not a moss, and that is correct. It is not a moss at all. It's actually something called an epiphyte. An epiphyte is just a fancy word that means air plant. And air plants only live off 3 things: sunlight, rainwater, and, well, air. And because of that, they're not actually parasitic. I've been asked quite a few times by many visitors that come here, are they parasitic? That is untrue. They're not parasites at all. Even though it does look kind of, it's hard to believe because they're pretty much on every tree to the point of suffocation. But they don't hurt them at all. In fact, they'll actually share some of the rainwater they collect with the trees they live on. So it's actually more of an unofficial symbiosis than a parasitic relationship. A little extra fact about Spanish moss. Spanish moss is actually a distant cousin to the pineapple. Anyone know why? Pardon? Alright. Well, that's because they're also epiphytes. They are air plants. They get their nutrients from the air. Yes. Don't eat it though. It's not going to taste the same. I did say we were distant cousins. Yes, ma'am. The Alston family? Yes, they own this entire portion right over here, as well as all these fields. This was the Oaks plantation at one point in time. In fact, every Alston, during when the plantation was just being created, owned every property here. But throughout the centuries, they would lose portions and portions of the property as they sold it off to other planters. The only plantation they really held claim to until 1911 was the Oaks plantation. Another alligator right over there. So, unfortunately, because I don't want to step over on the Oaks tour, I can't really go too much in depth on the Alston family. But if you want to learn more about the Alston family and the Oaks plantation, I recommend taking our Oaks tour. It's a really good tour if you want to check that out. Yes, unfortunately, you can't get into that territory. But yes, if you guys look at this tree over here, you'll see that it's that type of tree. Does anyone know what type of species of tree that is? No? But it's not a live oak tree, but a good guess. It's actually a gum. No, it's not. It's actually a gum tree. It's called a Tupelo gum tree. Does anyone recognize the name Tupelo? Anyone's guessing, you're probably thinking of Tupelo honey. That's correct. Those trees actually produce Tupelo honey. Now, Tupelo Honey Company is actually out of Florida. That's where they make the honey. They don't actually grow anything in South Carolina. I just like to mention that because that's the same species of tree where that type of honey is produced. You guys look at those two thin trees right up there. You guys see those two thin trees? At the tippy top, you'll see a dark green ball of leaves. Does anyone know what those dark green ball of leaves are? That is correct. That is mistletoe. Yes, that is mistletoe. Now, mistletoe is native to South Carolina, and it is parasitic. It feeds off of trees. Now, a lot of people wouldn't believe that it's native to here because it's so associated with Christmas in the wintertime, but it's true. This is actually, this is a state where all mistletoe comes from. Now, they are parasitic. They do feed off trees, and they are quite a nuisance to a lot of people who live in South Carolina. And though I am not native to South Carolina, I do have a lot of friends who are born and raised here. And they have told me that the best way of dealing with mistletoe is to take a shotgun and blow it off the branches. If that's not an extreme form of gardening, I don't know what is. There definitely should be a TV show. I'm going to call it Swamp People Extreme Gardeners. I'm only joking. If anybody works on Swamp People on the Discovery Channel, that is my creation. I need royalties there. Anyway. Well, that being said, I think I need to talk about how rice is grown, because that's totally what you guys came here for, right? You totally didn't just come here to look at alligators. I know that's not the best joke I have, but once it's in the script, it stays in the script. But that being said, I do need to talk about it. Now, rice growing season starts late March and lasts all the way to early September. Late March is when they plant all the rice, as I mentioned earlier. All the women come out and they plant all the rice in the divots. And once all the rice is planted, now it's just really a matter of flooding and draining the fields. That's just a log. I know it looks like an alligator, but it happens.
There was an alligator on it.
Was there an alligator on it? Tiny little guy? Yeah, sometimes little alligators are on that log. They blend in so well. But as I was saying, late March to early September, rice growing season. Now, after the planting is done, it's really just a matter of flooding and draining the fields. You gotta flood these fields because rice is an aquatic plant. It needs water to survive. It also has the benefit of killing off any weeds and insects in that field that are trying to take nutrients from the rice. So, when it's time to flood the fields, they're gonna go to the trunk gate. Imagine this area is my imaginary trunk gate. They're gonna open it up on the side of the tree during high tide. Once it's open, the water is going to immediately start flooding into the fields. And this water is going to stay in there for about a week and a half, but no longer. Any longer than that, that's when aquatic weeds are going to start growing. Things like sawgrass over here on the banks. And they'll do the exact same thing that land wheat will do. So when that happens, you got to go back to the trunk gates, and you got to open it up on the side of the field during low tide. Once this happens, water's going to start draining right out. Now, just for reference, this is not an immediate process. This takes about a day to flood and drain. Either way, it's not immediate. But once all the fields are drained out, all the women and men are going to come out with their rakes, and they're going to rake up all the weeds that were growing in that field. Get rid of all of them, and leaving the field in a good condition to be flooded again. And they're going to do this about 2 or 3 times a month until mid-July. Now, mid-July, the rice stalks are about 2 to 3 feet tall. They're about fully grown, and they're strong enough to have weeds in the field. You don't have to worry so much about dealing with weeds. Not yet. Get close. What? I'm sorry, you made an action. I thought. My apologies. Sometimes I jump the gun a bit. I made a spectacle of myself. I apologize. Now this poor girl over here, I'm mortifying her. It's all in good fun. We're all having fun here. But, yeah, so mid-July, the rice is going to be flooded. The fields are going to be flooded. And it's going to remain flooded until September. Now, this water is going to get stagnant, it's going to get smelly, and it's going to start breeding mosquitoes. And at that time, it caused an influx in swamp fever. So it was a very dangerous time to grow rice, but it was also the most important. This was essentially the final stretch. Once September finally rolls in, they're going to go back to the trunk gates, and they're going to drain the fields for the last time of the growing season. So all that mosquito water is going back in the creek. And once all the fields are drained out, all the women are going to come out, their sickles in hand, and they're going to collect the fruits of their labor. They're going to cut every stalk at the root in their field. They're going to collect them all. And once they're all collected, they're then going to hang them all out to dry. So you have to dry rice before you can begin a process called threshing. Now, threshing is essentially just kind of pulling the rice grain off the stalk. Now, a rice stalk can carry between 40 to 70 grains. No, I'm sorry, 20 to 40 grains of rice per stalk. Quite a bit. And originally, they had to pull it all off by hand. It was a very long, tedious process. But eventually, as you know, technology advances, they created other methods of making it flow quicker. One of them was considered the iron tooth, which is essentially kind of like a metal rake that you can just put rice stalks in, and you just kind of pull it through, and the rice grain will just immediately fall off into a basket. By the Industrial Revolution, they'll start automating it. Here's that alligator again. We didn't get a good look the last time.
Yeah. I'll show him one. On the bank. He's still now.
Moved a little bit. Sometimes you just need to take a break through the day. But yes. But once all the rice has been thoroughly threshed, they're going to collect all that rice, that now open rice grain in a basket, and they're going to transport it over to a rice mill. Now, a rice mill is a refinery. That is because they had to refine the rice that they collected. You see, rice that is not refined has a kind of like has a layer. There's a very tough layer that actually causes the rice to spoil really quickly. They figured this out when they were transporting this layer, or transporting this type of rice to other countries. By the time it got there, it was already spoiled. So they had to figure out a way to make it last longer. What they figured out is that if you basically crack open and you remove that hard layer, I forget what it's called, I think it's a bran layer. The bran layer, yes. It's left in a state that is more refined, called big grain rice, which is actually the predecessor to the long grain rice today. And originally they had to do that all by hand, basically using a mortar and pestle, just cracking open the rice and just removing it. And that takes forever. So what they did is they constructed these rice mills, which you have an automated system that would grind up the rice. You just kind of throw the rice from the basket into the machine, and it'll grind it all up, and it'll come out as refined big grain on the other side. Originally, it was powered by hydraulics, using the creek itself to power it. But by the time of the Industrial Revolution, they had gigantic smokestacks, brick smokestacks, that would use steam power to power the machinery. We actually have a smokestack from a refinery still remaining around here. If you take our trucker tour to our northern Springfield plantation, you'll actually see the remains of the refinery. It's really cool to look at. I recommend it. But once all the rice is refined, it's then going to be packaged into barrels, and these barrels are going to be transported on a flat boat through these creeks up to the two port towns here in South Carolina. One being Georgetown, the other being Charleston. Once it gets there, it'll then be put on a merchant ship, and this merchant ship's going to sail off wherever it needs to go in the world with the rice. And this process made South Carolina the wealthiest colony and eventually the wealthiest state in America. As I mentioned earlier, Brookgreen Plantation produced 3.9 million pounds of rice per year. That fed half the United States in 1800. These trees right here are actually bald cypress trees. These are the 130 feet tall trees I was talking about earlier. And that's the elusive Homo sapien, cousin of Homo neanderthalensis and the descendant of Homo erectus. If you wave at them, they'll wave back. They're a very friendly species, especially the adolescents. So there were others, but this was the most known, and this was the largest. These were the biggest income earners in South Carolina. In fact, it was the biggest income earner in the United States. All of the world's rice, at least the western hemisphere of the world, their rice came out of here. And it makes it even crazy, and you guys are probably wondering, because of how massive the industry was, you're probably wondering, well, what happened? Because we're Brookgreen Gardens, we're not Brookgreen Plantation anymore. We're not growing rice anymore. And this was primarily because of the Civil War. You see, a few things happened during the Civil War. One was self-sabotage, the other was abandonment. Now, those who stayed on the plantation during the war were so terrified of the Union Army coming down here and doing what they thought would be taking over the operation. They decided to do self-sabotage. That means that they would do scorched earth head tactics. They would destroy rice fields, destroy rice mills, clog up creeks, and many, many other things. All in the hopes that the Union Army wouldn't come anywhere near this place. Well, they kind of got their wish because the Union Army didn't come near here. That's because they didn't bother. They made a beeline right for Georgetown. So they really did all of this for no reason. Now, the northern plantations, they were affected. In fact, Springfield Plantation was shelled quite frequently by Union gunboats. But this area over here, no effect. Yeah, so they did this for really no reason. Now, those who just straight up abandoned the plantation just left it unattended. When they came back, after the war was over, all their freshly cultivated rice fields was just unfettered wild marshland, on top of those that were shelled or just destroyed by the locals. So, in just a matter of a few years, this plantation was in a pretty bad state. These plantations were in a bad state. And once the Emancipation and the 13th Amendment took effect, these all enslaved people were given their freedom. And they weren't just planters. A lot of people assume that people that worked on these plantations were just planting stuff. They didn't just do that. They were skilled workers. They had many type of skills that were specialized. There were iron workers, blacksmiths, metallurgists, architects, carpenters, and many other things. They ran these plantations. A lot of people don't realize how vital West African labor was, or African labor was on these plantations. Without them, these things wouldn't even run, at least not to the capacity they were. So when they got the chance to walk off the plantation and find work elsewhere, they took it and they never looked back. So in just a couple of years, these plantations went from the highest income earners in the United States of America to a shell of its former self. But it didn't end right there and then. It actually continued on for a few more decades. But it was truly never the same. It was on its last leg at this point. This is due to a few reasons. One was cost and labor issues, because now you actually had to pay your employees. Shock, right? No. And the cost, and remember, everything still had to be done by hand. The methods that they used at this point was the late 1800s, early 1900s, was the exact same as what they did in the 16 and 1700s, all the way to the 1800s. Everything was still done by hand. And it got to a point where you couldn't pay someone enough to risk their lives to work by hand on these plantations for hours on end. And it just got too expensive. And then the other issue was competition, because now other states like Arkansas, to this day is actually the rice capital of the United States of America, was growing rice, and they were growing a lot quicker and more efficiently. See, Arkansas didn't have our mud issue, so they could get machinery out there, and they could get things like water pumps that completely circumnavigate the natural irrigation system we have here. They didn't even need it. We just couldn't keep up with this changing time. And lastly, but certainly the most important, as I like to call the three nails in the coffin, was three massive storms, hurricanes in fact, that spanned between 1900 1900 to 1906. And one of them was nicknamed the Flag Flood. It got this name because this particular flood, hurricane created a small tsunami that engulfed the area and dragged the entire Flag family out to sea. On top of that, it introduced salt water and decimated the area. And salt water will kill rice. So by 1911, this area was in such a bad state that it was just abandoned. It became an unofficial hunting ground and a possible moonshining racket until 1930 when the Huntingtons purchased the property. As I like to say, that's history. As you can see, we're heading back into the docks. I just want to say thank you so much for riding with us today. You've been a very wonderful audience. If you have any last minute questions for me, I'm happy to answer them once we get onto the docks. But beyond that, I just want to say thank you, and I hope you have a wonderful rest of your day.
Thank you.
Thank you. If I please ask you just to remain seated until our captain gives us the A-OK to disembark, I'd really appreciate that. Thank you.
What does she have in her mouth? It looks like a lion on her.
I know we've always flashed past, I know I've always passed
All right, everybody, please follow me in a single file fashion, but please watch your step. It's a bit of a decline.
Watch your step down.
Said they were gonna wet, the guy says he was.